Welcome back to another episode of Steve and Friends. This week we cover economist William Phillips, best known for his contributions to economics, the Phillips curve.
Well,
but I've got shorter hair now, so hopefully that makes a difference. You got me.
I love making those. Welcome back to Steve and Friends. This week, we're going to try to discuss the economist William Phillips. William Phillips hailed from New Zealand. He's best known for the Phillips curve, which is something I really want to talk about today because there's a lot more depth to the curve than just a simple relationship between unemployment and the other factors. Also, he made quite a cool machine that I'm a big fan of. I'm working on a project for right now, a blog video type Minsky project. So that's another cool thing we'll talk about. That aside, and my shitty hosting skills aside, Steve, how have you been doing this week?
Okay, mate. I'm just busy working on this report for on climate change for a company inside the finance sector, and just working my butt off getting that done. So very busy as usual.
Nice, very nice. Well, it's better than doing nothing at all, I guess. Right?
Boredom is my life. Actually, I would love boredom. If somebody can send me some boredom, packaged nicely, even without Christmas paper, I'll take it.
You know what? Maybe I agree with you. Okay, so let's just start off and get right into it. I want to know who William Phillips was to you, and where does he fit into your kind of life's work, where, between the Minskys and, Keynes, where does he fit in that framework?
Oh, let's give him he calls himself Bill, so let's call him Bill Phillips. His first name was actually like the Advark or some, crazy 19th century style swishy name. But the middle was William, so he changed that to Bill. Now, in terms of where he fits, right at the top, basically. I think if I had to think of figures who I wish economics was based upon, Phillips is in the top 4 or 5. So I rank him with Goodwin, Schumpeter, Minsky, the same pantheon as those people, and with the added feature, which comes back to actually we were talking about Irving Fisher recently, and being a tinkerer who made physical models of what he was talking about. The main thing I got from Phillips, and this is something people wouldn't know if they only know about them through the so-called Phillips curve, is he was an engineer trying to bring engineering concepts into economics. And he was doing it in the 1950s. There were not computers that you could do that on. Or there were a handful of mainframe computers around the world, but the device we're seeing right now is his attempt to build a physical device, the so-called Phillips machine, using hydraulics to indicate the flows in a very particular model of the economy, I might add. It's not a general purpose model. This is a particular model based on multiplier, accelerator, and so on. But he was definitely trying to bring what engineers do into economics, and that's what I've ended up doing. So in some ways, I'm, if there's any major contribution I'll make in the history of economics, it'll be providing the tool which Phillips should have had back in the 1950s.
Yeah. So, I first heard about Bill
Mm.
through the Phillips curve, right?
Yeah.
And that was probably when I got into economics back in '08 during the financial crisis.
Hmm.
I heard about the relationship between inflation and unemployment. But beyond that, I didn't really know much more about him until about 5 years ago when I found your work and started
Hmm.
playing around with Minsky. And I saw you utilize a basic Phillips curve for wages increasing.
Hmm.
So I kind of looked into him a little bit more, watched a lot of your lectures that you post up on YouTube, and found out there was a lot more depth than a
Mm.
simple relationship that you see in the textbooks or what you hear or read on the internet pertaining to economics. And then about, I guess, 6 months ago, you gave me your library of Phillips papers, and you know
Mm.
that was great, right? There's just a ton of stuff.
Mm.
Um, and then I've really started focusing on his Phillips machine that he
Mm.
created, and it's called, I forget the name. Let me just look it up. What was the official name here for it? Um, well, the abbreviation is Moniac. So let's just look this up. I want to get Monetary National Income Analog Computer. Okay, I should have remembered that
Mm.
random word. But anyways, what it is essentially analog system dynamics, and that shit
Yeah.
I love. I love that stuff, right? So
Yeah,
I've
because
I
what we're doing digital computers fundamentally is simulating analog system dynamics.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
and
discrete. It's not discrete units. It's actually we're simulating continuous time with binary logic. But of course, given how fine-grained binary logic can be in a computer, it emulates what happens with an analog machine. But we're fundamentally doing analog modeling. That's quite true.
yeah, yeah. So I'm almost finished. I've built it in Minsky, which is
Okay.
surprisingly for how popular that machine was when it was first made as an educational tool. And there, I think, two left in some central banks around the world.
Mm.
There's not a lot of actual good documentation on it. Lots of pictures, lots of stories about it.
Mm.
But in order to replicate it in using system dynamics has been quite difficult because there's no set of parameters for it, right?
Okay.
There's some definitions for how it
Mm.
works mathematically, but they're very abstract. So
Mm.
what it really is it looks like a three stock model, but there's actually five other stocks that behave as legs so he was very ingenious. He would have a flow come out of a stock and then go into a smaller tank. That smaller tank was crafted in a way to create a leg. So it was
A
very
lag.
hard.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very hard to look at the diagrams and realize where the legs were and what was happening. And then also creating all the functions.
Mm.
He would literally have curved barriers inside of the tank, right, that would move in and out and up and down, which create like physical functions, right? So all of those I
Mm.
had to create. But it's pretty cool. There is one other, it's online somewhere, a very basic one of the machine itself. But this one
Mm.
I'm trying to go like historically on how it actually functions. So
Mm.
that's my story about Bill Phillips. What I want to know, and something that really piqued my curiosity listening to you years ago now, is the Phillips curve and the depth to it. I want to hear more about it beyond the relationship between employment, um, and inflation?
Well, I mean, the fundamental thing he was talking about is the what he called factor shares. He actually did talk in terms of income shares, factor shares, the same way the neoclassicals do, but with totally different modelling, of course. And he was saying that the hang on, I just realised that's my microphone is on. I wasn't quite sure. Pardon me. I've got 3 microphones here. I wasn't sure which one was working. He talked about factor incomes and fundamentally said factors can demand a larger share of GDP when employment is high. That's the employment of the factor. So if you have high employment of labor or high utilization of fossil fuels, or you have, you even talk about machinery in that case, strong boom in machinery production, those elements can mean that factor can get a larger share of GDP. And that was the fundamental idea. So he actually, it really came out of his attempt to build the sort of circuit diagram models you and I are building now in Minsky of the economy. And I might actually just, have you seen, you must have seen those papers yourself now, since I sent them all to you. But I'll bring up one of them because this is for the audience's benefit. So just wait till I get the right page and I'll make it a bit larger. So let's just see if I can do a share screen here. That's that one, isn't it? Okay. And this is the one I want to share. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. So that's the sort of diagram he was building. Now, that's a classic engineer's flowchart diagram of a dynamic system. And you can see you have D being a differential operator. The L-like symbol there is an integral. So what you've got is demand here and prices coming in through here. You get a difference between the two. The integral of that becomes one factor here, and I'd need to take a look at the paper to work out what that particular factor is. The differential becomes another factor here. So you've got the function itself, its integral and its differential, all feeding into a level of, I think this is probably labor utilization. And then you have that feeding into other plus and minuses down here. Now, if you look at it, I think you might get an idea where I got the design for Minsky from. Okay, because I've done literally what Fisher has done. A lot of, they're very better than me. The standard system dynamics programs use the bathtub analogy. So you get a bathtub and flows into it. And in my opinion, far too large and far too ugly elements to imply flows in and flows out and so on. I simply use the strict mathematical images. So our integral block literally has an integral sign at the beginning of it. Our differential block literally has the differential as part of it. So we enabled the building of models like Phillips using a more modern technology. But what he was trying to do was get to economists to use this and stop doing equilibrium modeling. That was his thing. He said the whole idea of equilibrium, fundamentally, does not fit a dynamic system. It'll be out of equilibrium. And I'm just going to go forward now and I've got to just make sure I find the right diagram. Notice that drawing there. Let's just make it a bit larger. So he said, we may therefore postulate a relationship between the level of production and the rate of change of factor prices, which is probably the form shown in figure 11, the fairly sharp bend where it passes through a zero rate of change of prices, being the greater rigidity of factor prices in the downward than in the upward direction. In other words, you will accept the increase in wage rates or profit rates or price of oil very happily. You're going to resist getting a lower price if you possibly can. So that was the diagram that he drew. And that, I'll just actually now go and see if I can find where that goes into one of his drawings here. Let's see, he doesn't actually, I think he actually puts it in one of the drawings. I've got to take a look and see. No, looks like he doesn't. But it was an argument, and I'm sure I remember him putting it in one of these diagrams. Probably about maybe this particular one. Let's go back a bit. No, okay, I'm making people dizzy and I'm not finding what I'm looking for. But fundamentally, that was to put an argument into here about the rate of change of prices. So you have a level of demand, how high demand is overall, causing feeding into a function. Let's see the function again, pardon me, bouncing around. So if demand is down here, you'll have wage cuts or you'll have drops in the price of oil, et cetera, et cetera. When it hits this point, there's neither increases nor decreases, and here you get sharp increases in prices. So he was putting this in, and this is just an element in a dynamic model. It is not a control system. Okay. The trouble is it was interpreted as a control system. And so when he did the Phillips curve diagram, he actually worked in terms of level of production. So that, if you like, this is going from zero employment here to 100% out this way. When he did the so he'd draw a diagram. And being an engineer, so therefore somebody who cares about empirical data, he thought, well, having drawn it, I better go and see if I can find it in the data. So he then quite laboriously went through trade union records to find data on employment levels and wage levels, because they would have a record of how many of their members were employed and therefore payers, and then what wages they were being paid as well. So he constructed a time series with about 80 or 90 1861 to 1913. And so we had yearly data where the unemployment rate is on the horizontal axis and the rate of change of money wages in percent is on the vertical. And out of that, he derived the Phillips curve. We'll talk a bit more about the logic, but that was his contribution. But what he really wanted to do was the engineering. Now, he produced this bloody diagram, and pardon me, but I'm going to have to swear it. It got treated as a menu. So you said, oh, if you want, and this is actually what he contributed to this mistake himself. If you want to have stable factor prices, then an unemployment rate of about 5% will give you stable factor prices. If you want to have stable consumer prices, then an unemployment rate of about 2% will give you stable consumer prices, or 2.5%. And that's what led to the interpretation of the Phillips curve, a simplified version of Keynes. Tell on X unemployment, you choose Y rate of inflation. That's how it was treated as a policy. And of course, all hell broke loose when that was tried in practice, because it was not a control system. It was an element in a dynamic, non-equilibrium system.
Right. So we go from 1940 to the 70s. It's treated as a control system. The 1970s happens. We have inflation, and
Yep.
the relationship breaks down, and we have Milton Friedman come in. Tell me a little bit about that period and that transition, and how the Phillips curve was somewhat debunked in the wrong way by the Chicago school. Kind of tell me about that area.
Hang on, we're having some streaming issues here. Let's see if it settles down. The Milton Friedman basically, licked his chops when he saw the argument being put forward by all the way that Phillips curve was interpreted. Not that he was all that fussed about getting his economic history of economic thought right, but because it was interpreted as a version of Keynes, then it gave him a very simple way to break Keynes, which is what his whole objective was, to eliminate the Keynesian approach to economics. And when it was interpreted as a menu approach, he then said, well, let's assume there is actually a short-run Phillips curve. And that's what Phillips has managed to find in the data. But if you try to make it a policy variable, so what's going to happen is you choose a particular inflation rate you want, and he then says inflation is caused by the rate of change of the money supply. So when you choose that rate of the money supply, you will get, for a while, you'll go up the short-run Phillips curve. But he interpreted that as unemployment falling below the natural rate of the economy. So he began with the assumption that there was a natural rate. This is where Nehru comes from. And by saying that you go up to a higher than full employment level, then once people realized that it wasn't actually real demand doing it, but artificially boosted monetary demand, people would then accept that inflation rate and go back to the natural rate of unemployment. And then you get another rise when they try to push it. So his whole approach was, let's assume governments are trying to push the unemployment rate below the natural rate, which is saying it's all set by real factors, not by monetary. The result of that will be accelerating inflation. And that's what the whole idea is, the so-called non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or Nehru, came from. So because it was interpreted as a menu system, and because inflation accelerated at that time, he said, Phillips' argument is broken down. But if you take a look at the data at the time, everything Phillips said causes inflation was in that data. And this is one thing you'd be aware from reading Phillips himself. So I'll just go back and quote from the opening of the paper, because he gave three factors. So if we know the unemployment and change, said it seems possible that a second factor influencing the rate of money wage rates might be the rate of change of the demand for labour and so of unemployment. Thus, in a year of rising business activity, employers were bidding more vigorously for the service of labour than which the average was falling. And conversely, in a year of falling business activity, employers will be less inclined to grant wage rises. So what you get is the rate of change of unemployment also turns up as an argument. And then he says the third factor is the rate of change of retail prices operating through cost of living adjustments in wage rates. Now, that's exactly what we saw in the 1970s. There were plenty of agreements, wage agreements between workers and employers, where part of the agreement was compensation for inflation. So those factors, and also the Vietnam War, added enormously to demand at the time. And he said one of his arguments was wartime restrictions on supply will also increase prices. So everything that Phillips said can cause inflation is what caused inflation in the 1970s. And yet Milton Friedman used that inflation rhetorically to undermine not just the Phillips analysis, but also Keynesian approach to economics.
Right. So we fast forward now, after the 70s and 80s, and thankfully Milton Friedman is a fairy tale now. Where does the Phillips curve stand now, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, every last model of the economy has an element in it where the level of factor incomes are determined by the level of economic activity. So as much as people say the Phillips curve doesn't exist, Phillips curves are dead, blah, 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 all their models include the level of demand as level of overall economic demand as a factor in setting the rate of change of money, of wages. So they're saying it's dead and we use it in every model we've got. Which sort of said the models are zombies, and I can sort of cope with that. So it's died, but it's undead. It's still in all their models. And yet again, this is what pisses me off about neoclassicals in general. They don't go back and ever read the original research. So they went back and read Phillips to say, the Phillips curve is dead. Look, these are factors he didn't take into account. Oh, God, he's got rate of change of unemployment as well as the level, and he's got wage price spiral, quite literally. That's a phrase he put in the article, wage price spiral. So it's dead and undead, and they're all using it. And what we really should be dead, and I think this is what they're actually saying, with them not being willing to admit it, the Nehru is dead, because the Nehru was always a zombie. So the idea that there was some rate of unemployment which would give you a constant level of inflation was the truly nonsensical idea. And you have had God knows how many economists have spent their lives and been interred after they've done it, measuring Nehru. And what is Nehru? It's a lagged moving average of the running unemployment rate. That's all it really amounts to in all those models. And Dan's asking, doesn't that add to support for trickle-down economics? Well, what it adds support for is that you will get increasing income for workers if you have a high level of employment. And in some ways, the Nehru argument is saying we can't let the unemployment rate get too low. We have to let it get to what the market would choose, the natural rate. So in that sense, it undermines workers' wage determination. So yes, there's the trickle down. The trickle down side of things is that, and actually Goodwin put this in his Goodwin cycle argument as well, that in a dynamic model of the economy, workers are effectively the predators and capitalists are the prey. When you map from predator-prey model dynamics to what you get out of the Goodwin model. So in that case, workers are benefiting out of the technological change over time, so long as they get employment out of that as well. So yes, in that sense, it does sort of give some sort of support for trickle down. But what we've had, of course, is a weakening of the capacity of workers to ask for wage rise, to get wage rises now. So the trickle down trickled off in about 1974.
Yeah, actually, let's digress a bit. just a little bit away from Phillips. That declining wage share started in the 1970s. What's your explanation of that happening? And it continues to this day in most Western nations.
To me, that was actually the first mild Minsky crisis. Because if you take a look at the data, including the level of private debt, which of course, I focus on all the time, I might see if I can get this up during this presentation, or we might actually talk about this in another show. But we had a debt-driven boom in 1970 to 73, and that was when I was at university. So, I began in 1971. I was 18, and when I went to a university, employment was so full that we got part-time jobs before going to become students, and you just line up at a factory, and there was a queue. You could join the queue, get a job, and be working in the factory. Half an hour later, the unemployment rate in Australia was below 1.5%. Now that continued on until early mid 1973, and then there was a crash in the real estate, particularly commercial real estate. This is talking in Sydney, but I also saw it in American data as well. So you had a debt bubble that burst, credit went not negative, but declined quite substantially. And in Australia's case, the unemployment rate went from 1.5%, I think at the beginning of 1974, to 5% by the end of it. And it never really recovered. So in some ways, that was the first big Minsky bust. And then in the aftermath, you've never had the level of aggregate demand and the level of economic activity and investment that you had back in the late 60s and early 70s. So that was the real initial cause.
What are the true control variables for price change? Steve?
Well, this is where, again, working from first principles is the right way to go about this. And Kalesky did that decades ago. So if you look at what's called Kalesky, K-A-L-E-C-K-I, price equation or profit equation, you'll find him defining output in terms of money, wages. You break output out of wages and profits, and then you can say money, wages. The wage bill is some fraction of GDP. So call that fraction call the fraction that goes to capitalist M. The fraction going to workers is 1 minus M, where M is effectively the markup that capitalists put on the wage bill they have to pay to set prices. And that then also reflects how many units of output you're getting per worker per hour. And that then gives you a relationship in terms of the wage level divided by your output to labor ratio, colloquially what they call the labor productivity. I don't like the term at all because it's actually capital productivity that's going on, not labor productivity. But let's call it, the standard output to labor ratio, labor productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a statement for equilibrium price. This is from Kalesky, saying the price level is 1 over 1 minus M, where M is the markup, times the money wage divided by labor productivity. Now that gives you, when you say what's the rate of change of prices, you differentiate that expression. And you get three things which can alter the price level. It's changes in the markup, it's changes in the money wage, and it's changes in labor productivity. So rising labor productivity will reduce inflation, rising money wages and a rising markup will increase inflation. And those are the factors. And you can generalize that to say whatever input you're regarding as external to your production process. So you've got to hire workers. You don't make workers in the factory. Equally, you don't make oil in the factory. So you've got to pay those as external costs. And you can do a matrix transformation of the whole equation as well and get a vector of prices rather than just an aggregate price level. But what that gives you is three factors: markups by capitalists, productivity of your productive system, and the cost of your inputs in money terms. Those are your three arguments. Now, when you go back to the 1970s, what you find was high unemployment, very high employment, very confident workers, and therefore the pressure was coming from wage rises. Okay? At the same time, you had the beginning, very, very early beginnings of shifting production offshore. So your productivity terms, in terms of your ratio of wages to output, was you had a rising ratio because you were using cheaper labor. So that was giving you a slight undercutting of the price inflation caused by domestic wages. And then you had a markup. And the markup, in Kalecki's analysis, and I think this is generally true, the markup is restrained by the degree of competition that capitalists feel amongst each other. So if you have an enormous level of aggregate demand, you are going to have very little perceived competition between capitalists in a particular industry, because put a car on the showroom floor and it drives itself out the door. So the high level of demand is going to mean capitalists are more willing to put in markups, increase markups. Workers are more likely to demand wage rises, and you're likely to get rising productivity, which therefore reduces your rate of inflation. So those three are your major factors. Hang on. I find Minsky really... Okay, let's bring that one back again, Dan. I want to take another look at that. Let's see. Okay. If you find Minsky intimidating, yeah, we could do with some tutorials on how to use Minsky. Maybe we should do that occasionally as well, Ty.
And
you do need...
And also, if you go to profstevekeen.com/Minsky, there is a huge 250 plus page textbook on how to use the Minsky software. It's basically, Steve, you might agree, an extension or an augment to your last book, The New Economics.
Yeah.
And in fact, for me, it's more interesting because it's that technical part. So, and it's free to download. So if you are intimidated, check out my videos and download the actual textbook that Steve has essentially made and given out for free.
And that front, by the way, mate, a lot of features of Minsky I don't use that you do use. So I think we should actually make that a joint project that becomes Keen and Keynes. Okay?
Yeah, I think so. I think
we work on that. Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Okay, because I mean, you use the lookup tables in a way that I haven't done before. So there's elements of Minsky that you make better use of than I've done. And I didn't include grouping in that manual because we hadn't actually nailed grouping properly at the time I wrote that particular draft of the manual. Now we have pretty much nailed grouping, so it's now time to talk about grouping, and you use grouping quite effectively. So yeah, that's the main thing. But by the way, it is, I heard a lot of mathematics in that book. The Botchman Daler, hi, my Twitter correspondence. Once you get in there, just if you find the mathematics intimidating, just skip over the top of it. Read the text and take a look at the diagrams, and that'll give you an idea to how it's going.
Yeah, my advice too there is, when I first started getting into system dynamics, the math was quite overwhelming to me. But the one thing with Minsky and the other programs too is the diagrams are quite intuitive. So just start from there. Learn you've got an inflow and an outflow for stock and go from there. And then the math, it comes to you afterwards. It's just like anything, a repetitive process. And the next thing you know, you're doing calculus. So.
And mate, you're doing incredibly complicated models. I mean, the level of detail in your models is mind-blowing. And the thing is, the advantage of the flowchart and also the tabular approach that Minsky provides, and no other software package does, is that you can keep track of the causal relations and add the details slowly, which is what you've obviously been doing, and end up with incredibly intricate models where the logic works, and that's quite remarkable.
Yes. So we'll dial it back here because I wanted to carry on with that declining wage rate, and we've gone into what are the price control variables. We're here in 2022. Our wages are still declining for our workers. What has to change to stabilize that and maybe take it the other way a little bit, in your opinion?
Well, one of the problems is the level of labor productivity, the output per worker, and that has been boosted artificially by globalization. And we're now going in the reverse direction there. We're also seeing climate change affecting physical productivity. How well do we turn physical inputs into physical outputs? All those factors are going to mean rising prices. And I think there is no solution to that. We have had an artificial period of 40 years now of globalization reducing per unit production cost by using cheap labor. Not only was that running out of steam, particularly in China, but running out of steam globally as well. But also, of course, when COVID came along, and now we've got the resource limitations of the limits to growth striking us as well, you get diminished productivity out of that. That's going to give us rising prices relative to incomes, I think, no matter what. So I think that's stuck. Labour, in some ways, because employment is still quite high, certainly in America, there's some bargaining capacity for workers to get a higher wage out of that. But I think the main thing that caused the inflation was actually the first factor hang on, I forgot who. Pardon me, I'm a bit too tired. The first factor is the level of markup by capitalists, which Koleski argued was restrained by the degree of competition they felt in their respective markets. Now, if you have the level of stimulus we needed for COVID, and it was needed, I would never argue against that stimulus, but that caused an enormous amount of monetary demand for largely commodities. We weren't buying travel anymore. So you had a shift in demand from services like travel across to physical commodities during the lockdown period. And you also had the fiscal stimulus was so large that people had a large amount of money to spend, and that also turns up in the level of pressure on the economy. So that meant that capitalists felt less competition. Okay, plenty of people demanding their goods, so they could put the markups up. And I imagine what has been the major cause, I'd say the main cause in price rises in the last year and a half has firstly been the disruptions caused by COVID to supply chains, and then increased markups by manufacturers who think they can get away with it because the level of monetary demand is so high. Now, what we're likely to see, courtesy of the interest rate rises that central banks are putting in and the pressure to go back and, fiscal rebalancing, all that nonsense, is we're going to cause a recession, and that'll mean that capitalists see more competition in getting their goods out the doors, so they'll drop prices.
So increasing output productivity is deflationary force, if I understand it correctly. If so, why is there this idea of inflation as a desirable state of the economy? Steve?
Largely because what you get out of that is a desire to spend money. And you can see this in the empirical data. So if you go to the St. Louis Fred database, one of the few databases I highly recommend. It's very well organized. It's a bit overwhelming in terms of how much information is there now. But search for velocity of MZM, which stands for money of zero maturity. And you'll see this is a device trying to do, worked out by a guy called William Barnett. There's two William Barnetts, and one of them's a friend of mine, and he did this work. And it was a very detailed way of trying to measure what actually works as money, because the whole idea of zero maturity is that you can instantly spend it. Okay. So bonds are not money. Okay, bonds you've got to sell, and then you can sell them. They're very liquid, but they're not money. Whereas money of zero maturity is stuff which you can instantly go and buy a Mars bar at the local shop. So the velocity of MZM was then, how many times does that money stock turn over compared to GDP? And the answer was about 1.8, all the way through to about 1966. Then when you had the rising inflation, this very much coincides with the Vietnam War period. You had that velocity rising up to a peak of about 3, I think. And then when you had the Volcker inflation crushing recession, the velocity plunged. And we're now possibly, I think, at the level of MZM with the velocity of turnovers either 1 or below 1. They're not actually recording MZM anymore. But that is an example where the velocity of money is related to the rate of inflation. So a high rate of inflation caused a very high desire to spend. And that's partly why I think you can see with the Bitcoin brouhaha that Bitcoin is rising, and used to be rising in value, and that meant there was a strong discouragement in spending it. So it was actually negative in terms of effective demand to have Bitcoin. If you have an appreciating currency, you're less likely to spend, because each time you spend, you give away something which will be of more value. Simply hang on to it. So a bit of inflation is a way of stimulating spending, and that's where the three roles of money conflict with each other. So store of value, which is what the Bitcoin mob accentuate, measure of account, and that remains all the same all the way through, and means of payment. And if you accentuate the store of value, then you degrade the means of payment. And fundamentally, money has to be something which enables transactions to occur, or you haven't got a capitalist economy. But that's one reason inflation is a small amount of inflation is seen as a positive.
Great. Wow, that's super in depth. So our producer Daniel's put up another question. He's putting up all the hard ones. In mathematics, the determinant is a scalar value that is a function of the entries of the square matrix. What? Do you know what that means, Steve?
Yeah. I do, and actually you don't. You're telling me you don't know.
I don't know.
Well, what it shows, mate, is your talent, because if you can do the modeling you do without knowing that, you're doing extremely well. So a matrix is simply an array of numbers, and the matrix is a way of solving a set of simultaneous equations, or expressing a dynamic system as a set of numbers times you have a rate of change of a system is a set of numbers times the current state of the system, that sort of thing. And you can work out by separating out the numbers from the variables, then you can determine the behavior of the system out of the characteristic of that array of numbers alone. And if you imagine, like if I'm saying the rate of change of the location of this water bottle compared to my mouth is minus 0.1, means every second I'm moving at 0.1 of a meter closer to my mouth. Okay, so it's coming towards my mouth. If the determinant's plus 0.1, I'm moving it away. So the determinant is simply a way of representing whether the matrix is pushing you towards equilibrium or away from it. And then with a scalar system, if I say the rate of change of the location, let's say this is 0 here, and the rate of change of the location, I'm trying to make sure this bottle still turns up despite the background effect of the graphics there. Okay, let's just move from here. So I'm here, it's there, it's moving towards me. That's going to be a determinant. The scale will be negative. Dx dt equals minus something times x. If it's going away, dx dt equals plus something times x. But those are the only choices you got. It's either 0, so it doesn't move, so it stays where it is, minus, so it moves towards the equilibrium, or positive, so it moves away. Now, when you're working in a matrix, of course, it isn't just a single horizontal plane you're working on. A two-dimensional matrix, 2 by 2, gives you the x location and the y location as well. And so you can still move towards the equilibrium that way, but you can also cycle around it, okay? And you can spiral out and spiral down. So the determinant can give you values that mean you converge to equilibrium, you move away from equilibrium, or you fluctuate around equilibrium. And those are important ways of characterizing the behavior of a dynamic system.
Well, Thomas, thank you for making me look dumb. And Steve, great explanation. I guess next week we'll be covering square matrices, and I'll spend the next 7 days trying to master this to have it in my toolbox.
we might do that. Let's go back to Phillips anyway, because I think we need to talk a bit more about him as both a human being and as an economist whose work was neglected.
Okay, let's do that. Daniel, can you take down that question? Our producer and our background is just out of control today. He's on vacation. He's on a micro trip right now, so I don't know. I don't know where his state of mind is. So we'll go back. I don't know if I really got the answer. If we got far enough. Or if we can take it further, but how can we stabilize the shrinking share of wages in our economy?
Well, I think that the long-term dilemma there is that we are ultimately moving towards a production system where we use robots in the place of labor. Okay, labor is now restricted to inputs to manage machinery, and the whole focus of industrial technology over time is to use more machinery and more energy and less labor. And for a long time, that didn't matter because you couldn't operate a machine without a labor input because the machine itself is dumb. Now we're getting to smart machines. Then the actual operation of the machine can be determined by the machine itself. You then only need skilled labor for maintenance and repairs of those machines. So I think that's the long-term trend. It's one reason that I favor bringing in a universal basic income, because ultimately labor is going to have no bargaining power. As we further and further automate, and this is leaving us having climate change, of course, which is going to, I think we're going back to the stage where we're going to be carrying buckets around everywhere to try to stay alive. But if the trends of current industrialization continued, then ultimately you're weakening labor's capacity to bargain, because ever since computers and then numerically controlled machines and now artificial intelligence, which is really algorithmic intelligence, that is meaning that a whole lot of the functions that used to require a human to intervene in are no longer necessary. And at that point, I think that's why, as I sort of see, if we don't do something about it, we're going to have a sort of Hunger Games future.
How dramatic?
And Daniel's asking about policy. That's where I think we need wage price agreements. Okay, we need then this is why again I go for universal basic income, because I think the bargaining power of workers is going to be eliminated. Leaving out climate change, which is a crazy thing to leave out, but I've got to do that in these discussions. 30 more years of the direction of development of technology will mean that you virtually need no labor at all to produce output. And that is scary, because you need you need labor to demand output to have the level of economic activity we've got used to. And that is, of course, meaning that workers get part of the physical surplus out of the energy and material we dig out of the planet. If you get to the stage where you can produce that output without labor, with only tiny amounts of labor, then you've weakened the bargaining position of the vast majority of the population. And we need a way to enforce that. And that means it's not the market system that gives you that anymore. It's the political system.
Right. So I just want to state for the people asking questions, I didn't get Dan to pull down the question because I don't want to hear them. Dan's actually helping me out because I am a terrible host. This is not my forte. But fortunately, I am...
You're getting better.
I'm getting better. I can make...
Especially the appearance is helping.
Yeah. So really, and the lucky thing for me is Steve can go on for an hour just talking. So I'm actually good.
Lucky and unlucky.
So keep asking your questions. I want to kind of sandwich Phillips here a little bit. We have Jay Forrester, which obviously pioneered the computer aspect of it. We have Phillips, who was doing the analog aspect of it. But very recently, I heard Irving Fisher also had a hydraulic machine. Now, based on equilibrium, can you kind of tell me a little bit about where he kind of fits in that process, and then how it dovetails with Phillips kind of later down the line?
I think it's extremely interesting element that both Phillips and Fisher, who made enormous contributions to non-equilibrium economics, were both tinkerers and builders. So Phillips built, as part of his PhD thesis, he built a machine that would calculate Volra's prices. And in fact, he started building the machine before he even knew about Volra. We're talking back in the 1800s. So the late 1800s, you didn't have the level of instant access to work being done in other languages. So I think when Fisher began building his multi-sectoral model of equilibrium prices, he effectively had Volra's atonement system in there without knowing he'd reproduced Volra. So that's the initial thing. And then, of course, he made his money by selling the Rolodex, which is the predecessor of personal digital organizers. He sold that to the Rand Corporation and made a fortune. So he was a tinkerer. And Phillips was an engineer. He was both a hydraulic engineer and a electrical engineer. And he did his training, I think, related with the hydroelectric schemes in New Zealand back in the pre-war period. So he not only did he build a physical model, which is the Moniac you've been talking about, he also built an analog computer. So he literally used valves and resistors, etc., to make an analog computer. And the thing about that, it was programmable. So it was very complicated to program. Of course, you didn't have the sort of graphical user interface we're used to now, but you could actually make a different model by putting together different elements into the model. So they were both physical tinkerers, and what they did fundamentally was what Forrester then built in software. And when you look at the timing, Forrester's article which led to the building of the very first system dynamics program, was after Phillips's papers on, what's he got here? Let's read the 1954 paper. Title is Stabilization Policy in a Closed Economy. And what he would use that with the whole idea of time lags between production and demand, and using time constants and different types of lags in the whole system, and then the flowchart dynamics that was also built in Demoniac. So Phillips was actually technically ahead of Forrester. What he didn't have was a programmer, and so this is the very early days of computers. He didn't have a computer either, but because Forrester was at MIT, then there were very early computers were there at MIT. At the time that Forrester came up with the idea of system dynamics, I'm guessing there were certainly less than 100 computers in the world. There may have been even less than 10, but one of them was at MIT. And so one of his colleagues programmed the very first system dynamics program, which predates the GUI as well. It was a programmable system. And it's the acronym, and it must be the most annoying acronym in the history of acronyms. It was SIMPLE. Simulation of industrial management problems using lots of equations.
Yes, I know. So that was basically, he did his initial paper on that, I think, because I look into Forrester a lot. I think it was 58. It was called Industrial Dynamics something. It predated the Industrial Dynamics book, which was about a year later. So I think in the annals of the system dynamic community, that was around the birth date of system dynamics. Obviously, like you said, so much, material kind of came in before that. So it was a slow evolution. It's something I bring up too, as I've read more and more into Phillips. He was ahead of that curve, right? So he is mentioned by some of the really, the elder system dynamic people out there, because they recognize his contributions and have done the historical research themselves. But for the most part, he is not included with system dynamics. So
and he should
be. It's by no means takes away from what Jay Forrester did. Jay Forrester brought in the digital age, for engineering. But there was that slow build before it. We do have this I want to go back to the neoclassical will save us. I want to go back to this question because I kind of cut it off. Was this the question, Daniel? Oh, okay. Hold on. We've got other plans from the producer.
Okay. That was last question was a good one. Bring it back again.
Which one? This one?
Thank you, mate. Okay. Yeah. A usable package. That's quite a challenge because the main thing we find when we show, particularly when you show the old-fashioned system dynamics diagrams, the actual generators of those models literally call themselves spaghetti diagrams. Look like somebody dumped a bowl of spaghetti on the table. You've got to follow the cables around. It was impossible. So a major design principle of Minsky has been trying to minimize the use of cables and enable values to be passed by variable rather than passed by wires. And it also means you can break your model down into small components. So, and the third thing is with the Godley table, where you have exclusive system states. So you're either sober or you're drunk, okay? You're either stoned or you're not stoned. You're either got COVID or you haven't got COVID, stuff of that nature. It's possible to use that and you simply go, here's the transition from sober to drunk. I'm going to work on that later at dinner tonight, by the way. So yeah, I'm getting ready. So you can actually show, here's the system state of being sober, system state of being drunk, and the rate at which you transfer from being sober to being drunk, depending upon the day of the week and time of day, et cetera, et cetera. So with a Godley table, where you can work with exclusive states, you don't even have to see a single differential equation. And then you say, take people first, do you agree that somebody drinking is going to get drunk? You do. Oh, well, okay, we're going to sound that line. And do you agree that if they take longer, they're going to sober up? Oh, right. Okay. So a few little things like that, and you can ultimately build a structured model where somebody reads the table, then they understand the structure of the model. And then you can say, well, let's look at our causal factors here. So you can break the causal factors down to small bits as well. And again, Ty's models, I think, are exemplary on how to do that. And so you can actually get it to the stage where a person agrees with the structure and agrees with each of the little bits, they agree with the model. And then you can say, okay, you now understand the model. Let's see what it does when we simulate it. So that's a major element. Is it possible to do a model that includes corruption of the political system? Sure. You just basically have an extent to which, politicians siphon off money to their friends, for example. And, you have a degree to which that occurs, and you have a different degree in Singapore to what you might have in America. If anybody's been in Singapore and lost anything important, the person who found it will chase you from one side of the island to the other, trying to give it back to you, and will refuse payment when they turn up. And I've had to experience twice in my own life in Singapore. Do it in America? Bye-bye.
Yes. Modeling something like that on political corruption would be kind of what you call soft variables. So you can model like monetary economics. They're hard variables. It's you got $1 or you don't have $1. You can model behaviors using system dynamics and use abstract units to represent the behavior. So yes, you can model political corruption using system dynamics. What else do we have here? Where was that question? I can't. Oh, well. Yes.
I try, and it's lucky for me to meet Ty and see how all this stuff is done. I have Daniel as well, being the fabulous producer and communications man, keeping us all together. So, there's certainly a lot of luck in trying to get a non-orthodox approach to economics together. And I'm lucky with the support I've got as well.
Steve, how can everybody find you online, your work? Where do you want them to go? Tell me.
2 locations, my Patreon site and my Substack site. Patreon has the advantage that you have a minimum payment level of $1 a month, which is suitable for students, I would hope. So that's the website there that Daniel's just popped up there. And the Substack, which is profstevekeen.substack.com, that has a free level, so you can actually sign up for free. And like in both my Patreon and my Substack, virtually every post is free. I don't put stuff behind a paywall. But then Substack has a minimum 5, it has 120 a year, and it has 600 a year, and that's it. So if you want to just be in touch with what I'm doing and not give me any financial support, the free level at Substack is the easiest one. If you want to give me a minimum amount of support, Patreon is feasible. So Patreon or Substack. And on both of them, I'll post, particularly on Patreon, I'll post models and lecture slides there, because it's actually much easier to do that on Patreon than Substack.
Right. You can also find Steve at Prof. Steve Keen on Twitter. Where else can you find him? You can find him at youtube.com/ at Prof. Steve Keen. By the way, people, YouTube's putting at before the channel name now, so just so you know, you can find him there. We've got his website, profstevekeen.com. I think it's a work in progress, but it does have some of his papers there.
Yeah, I'm pretty hopeless on that. Anybody wants to work for me to get my papers up, let me know. I'm desperately out of date in getting that done.
So there's a ton of resources out there for Steve if you want to look at his work and kind of dive a little deeper, on the subject matter that we were talking about today. We're kind of at the top of the hour, so we're going to be back next week. Daniel will be hosting the show. We're going to take the 24th off, Christmas Eve, and we're going to take the 31st off, and then we'll be back in January. We have quite a few guests in January. They're top secret at this point, but some good friends of Steve. So we're looking forward to that. So until next week, I'm Ty Keynes with Steve Keen. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And we did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it. So fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning.